Thank you. So I have kind of a long, full name, so I abbreviate it to Zomiji on Twitter and elsewhere. I am from the US, but I've lived in Amsterdam now for about a year and a half with my husband and my 2 kids. We're having our little European adventure right now. And I have been doing web design professionally for about 15 years. I'm currently a senior designer at Booking.com, and I do both design and HTML and CSS in that role. We are hiring if you want to come work there. One of the things that I think is fun about working there is seeing the rather creative names and photos that properties provide to us. For instance, you could stay at Wrong Place. There's also hell and heaven, and I gotta admit, hell looks pretty nice. And then there's Jesus. And this is my favorite line from the property description. Jesus offers free private parking and free Wi-Fi throughout the house. Thank you, Jesus. So these are only a few of the over 794,000 properties providing Booking with their content and photos for us to display. That content then has to be translated into 42 different languages, and the prices that you see on the site are in 54 different currencies. So the things that I design have to be incredibly flexible to fit all this incredible variation in content. So if I have to design a component that includes the name of a property, for instance, that name might be as short as 2 characters, or it might be as long as this 109-character long, gargantuan of a name. So how big do I make this component, to be flexible enough to fit this variable stuff in an elegant way? In responsive web design, the challenge is that you never know how much space is available outside the component to fit it into. Here, the problem is kind of the opposite, not knowing how much stuff is available inside the component. But in both cases, the question is the same. How big do I make this thing so that everything will fit nicely? In responsive web design, you answer this question by picking a percentage, an M or REM unit, or a viewport unit based on what will work well for that item and the majority of the items most of the time. And these are all good relative units of measurement, but they are not perfect. There's still a decision that you are making ahead of time rather than a calculation made on the fly for an individual user's unique set of viewing conditions and the precise piece of content they're viewing at that moment. They're always going to be your best guess at what will work best for the majority, but not necessarily the ideal for one thing in particular. And don't get me wrong, I have nothing against using these units of measurement. These are the units of measurement that I've chosen to use in my work for the past 10 years, whenever possible. But any imposed unit of measurement is always going to be an approximation of the ideal. Flexbox is not the ideal either. It's just a tool with strengths and limitations, just like any other. But it gets us closer to the ideal, because with it, we no longer have to set explicit dimensions at all. We can let the browser figure out what size is best based on the space available, the surrounding elements, and the content within. We still get to tell the browser a starting point for the size or proportion to give it some guidance. But we're not laying down a law as we are with explicit dimensions, even relative ones. Let me give you an example of the difference between the 2 approaches. Here is the job search form on the Guardian site. It is responsive, so they give all of the fields percentage widths, and they change those percentages at different breakpoints. Even the select and the button have those percentage widths. And they didn't use Flexbox on this form as they do now on their main site. They still are using floating here. So I decided to make a copy of this form to see if I could enhance it in any way by adding Flexbox, just as an exercise for me, not because there's anything wrong with how they're doing things currently. So here's my copy. It uses floats and percentage widths as theirs does. And this was my starting point. I then tried to see if there was anywhere I could add Flexbox to make this form more responsive. And I found 2 opportunities for simple progressive enhancement. The first issue is that because the select menu is set to a percentage, not its content length, the content can sometimes be cut off at different viewport sizes. Also, the button can grow much larger than its text, which looks rather awkward, in my opinion. Even if you like it large like that, which is fine, the point is that you can't control it. The viewport is controlling it, and sometimes it will be snug to its text, and sometimes not. The percentage sizing becomes kind of arbitrary. This is the problem with explicit dimensions. Now, I could fix it by tweaking the breakpoints and making sure that the layout doesn't change until I'm sure that the select menu content could fit. But this is unreliable. You can't always create a whole new set of breakpoints to accommodate one piece of content on one page out of your whole site. Also, it's dependent on all users having the same font size and on the content in that select menu never changing, both of which I think are not safe assumptions. This is the perfect case for Flexbox because, as I said, it lets you avoid explicit dimensions and use the flex property instead to control sizing. So the flex property tells the browser the starting size that you want to use, including the native content size, and whether that item can grow bigger or smaller than this size to fit the space available. So with the select menu and the button, I want them to stay at their content width exactly and not grow any bigger or smaller. I do not want them to flex. With the text fields, I want them to stretch to take up whatever space is left after the select, the button, and the margins are all accounted for. And I don't have to do any math to figure out what value this should be. I just tell them to flex and let the browser figure out the math. Computers are really good at that stuff. And I can keep the percentage widths in place for non-supporting browsers and just add these flex values on top as an enhancement. The second problem with the original is that there's a slight misalignment of the fields across the line, even though I set the same padding on all of them. So this shows 2 different browsers. Again, I could fix it by adjusting the paddings by a couple of pixels here and there, but this is browser dependent, so it's really hard to get perfect. A more reliable and much easier fix is to just turn on Flexbox on each field wrapper, because flex items across a row are equal height by default. So with its wrapper flex container, each field will stretch to match the tallest one on the line. So these 2 lines of CSS in pink fix the height mismatch in 5 seconds. And actually, you can write it as 1 line. You can leave the second off because it's the default. So although the visual effect isn't huge in this case, neither is the effort to polish up this form. None of the Flexbox changes I made to this form have to be hidden from older browsers. They simply override existing properties. I'm in browsers that understand them, which made it really easy to progressively enhance this form. IE 9 and earlier will see the top version, which looks a bit different, but is still usable. And just about everyone else will see the bottom version. I think this enhancement is worthwhile to add because even though the Flexbox version uses the same breakpoints as the Float original, the fields inside are more responsive to their content. So overall, the layout of the fields looks more proportional inside each of these breakpoints. Content-driven breakpoints are better than device-size breakpoints, but they are still a decision that you're making based on what is best for, hopefully, the majority of your content, but not every component or piece of content on every page. Flexbox can enhance your components to be more responsive within your breakpoints. Now, the job form was just a demo, but we use Flexbox in a similar way live on Booking.com on our customer service form, which uses a fluid, responsive layout. Using Flex, the fields fill the full width of their container no matter its size, switching from stacked to 2 by 2 automatically as soon as there's room for them to fit. And by automatically, I mean no media queries. This is all of the CSS needed to create those 2 layouts. There's no media query because the browser figures out the breakpoint for you using Flexbox. The flex property, again, is simply an enhancement on top of the floating and percentage width that control the layout of the form when Flexbox is not available. So the starter non-Flexbox version of the form is seen in IE 7 through 9. And yes, we support IE 7 at Booking.com. It has the same 2 layouts. They just don't stretch to be full width. But I think this small difference is an acceptable trade-off for being able to write just a few lines of CSS, no media queries, and being completely done with laying out an entire responsive form. Let me walk you through how this CSS works. First, we turn on Flexbox by setting display flex on the container, and this turns the form into a flex container and the child fields into flex items. By default, this puts the items horizontally on a single row, but flex wrap set to wrap allows them to wrap onto multiple rows as needed. So without flex wrap, the fields would stay on one single row no matter what, even if content got cut off or they overflowed. But with flex wrap, they will be stacked on narrow screens and then automatically switched to side by side when there's room for them to fit. It's similar to changing flex direction from column to row inside a media query, but without needing any media query, so that the breakpoint can happen automatically in a more natural spot with less CSS. So the fields do stay row orientation the whole time. It's just that they may take up to 4 rows. So then the question is, what makes them decide to wrap? The browser wraps them when it can't fit them on one line, but how does it know they can't fit? This is where their flex values come in. So let me define the flex property first before explaining this particular value. The flex property is set on flex items to assign them a proportional size. And it affects either their width or height, whichever is the main dimension along the main axis. So the main axis is set by flex direction. If flex direction is set to row, my main axis is horizontal, and width is my main dimension. If flex direction is set to column, my main axis is vertical, and height is my main dimension. And there are up to 3 components of the flex value, which is a shorthand property. Flex grow means how much the flex item will grow relative to others if there's extra space available. Flex shrink means how much the item will shrink relative to others if there's not enough space for everything to fit. And both of flex grow and flex shrink are set to unitless integers like 0, 1, 2, because they're specifying a proportion, not an absolute size. It's like the number of extra shares of space that they get. Flex basis is the initial starting dimension before free space is added on or taken away from the item. And it's set to any standard width or height value, including auto, which basically sizes the item according to its native content size. So, for example, on the Booking.com customer service form, flex basis is set to 40%. And percentages work just the same way in Flexbox as outside of it. So each field will start out being 40% of the width of its parent. That's the starting point. The browser then looks at the flex grow and flex shrink values to decide whether to get bigger or smaller than the flex basis value. Flex shrink, the second value, set to 0, doesn't let the fields shrink smaller than 40%. Effectively, this means that the most we can ever have on a line together is 2, because 3 or 4 40% wide items are never going to fit on a line together, right? So that's why the form only ever lets the fields end up in a 2x2 layout at its widest. Flex grow, set to 1, means each will get 1 share of any available extra width on the line. And this is what ensures that the form is always full width, because it tells each field to stretch to take up whatever space is left after the 40% flex basis and the pixel margin and padding have been accounted for. Basically, when the viewport is narrow, the combination of the percentage flex basis and the pixel margin and padding makes 2 inputs add up to more than 100%, forcing them to wrap and stack. The same thing happens with the float version. But with the flex value as an enhancement, the flex grow value of 1 ensures that when this wrap happens, each field stretches to fill the width perfectly, rather than remaining 40% wide. Flexbox overrides the floating and width values automatically, so the flex property can be added onto the same rule without having to hide anything from non-supporting browsers. So it's just 3 extra lines of Flexbox CSS that made this form much more responsive to the space available, and all without having to use a media query. Another place on Booking.com where we change the layout without a media query is within the map info windows that show when you click on a marker. I had the task to add a message about the price, the room price that you see being almost sold out. The logical place to put it seemed to be next to the price, right? Because it's related to that, especially since there's often a big gap there. And this is what that would look like. So the price and message are visually connected. The message kind of leads you to the call to action button. So I like this. But the problem is that there is not always a big gap there. Rack rate pricing, long languages, long currencies can take up a lot of space. In this case, this is due to variable content, but the same issue applies in responsive web design, of course, where the width that you have available to put something in varies as the viewport changes size. In both cases, I have the problem of wanting to put something in a spot, but not being sure if that spot is always big enough. What I would like to happen is that the text sits beside the price if there's enough room, and when the space shrinks below some minimum width that I set, it just drops down onto the following line and then stretches to take the full width. Now, without setting an explicit width on the availability message, the red text, making it float or inline block will not let its text wrap. So this first image with the red text wrapping could not happen. The text would want to stay on one line, and so it would drop down below the price. Table cell will let the text wrap within that area, but it won't let the entire block wrap down below the price when the space is too narrow. So this second image with the message below the price could not happen. So that leaves Flexbox, which is kind of like the best of both worlds and allows me to get both of these layouts at once. So I get the stretch and squish behavior of table cell, but it lets boxes wrap if I tell it to and it needs to. And again, it does this without media queries. So IE 7, 8, and 9 users will simply see the availability message always below the price, which again doesn't look bad or broken. And then the few lines of Flexbox code are then layered on top as an enhancement for the vast majority of users. Flexbox is great for this sort of micro layout stuff, managing the sizing and spacing of items within a component or module. So you can use Flexbox in a similar way in responsive designs where you have a component that sometimes has rooms for its sub-items to sit side by side and sometimes does not. Another example of how Flexbox can handle wrapping more elegantly is in what we call the mini info windows on our maps that show when you hover over a marker. I use Flexbox to lay out the review score and the price on opposite sides of the same line. Again, I couldn't give either of these two blocks a width, even in percentages or ems, because the length of the content in each can vary wildly. Without set widths, inline-block would not move the price block to the right side, so that was out. Table cell worked fine without set widths, but if the content was long, the two pieces could overlap each other instead of the second block wrapping to a new line, which of course would be totally unacceptable to have two pieces of text laying on top of each other. So that left float and Flexbox as my layout options. Floating worked, but when the content was long and the price wrapped to a second line, it would stay right aligned, as in this example, which looks kind of weird. So I decided to use both, float for older browsers, and then I overrode it with Flexbox, which lets the text wrap to the left side more elegantly, as in this example right here. And I didn't have to use Modernizr and hide pieces of CSS from certain browsers. Flexbox just takes over if the browser understands it. So no matter what, the two blocks will appear side by side in all browsers, and they will wrap when needed. The wrapping and alignment of the text just isn't quite as nice looking in non-Flexbox browsers. But that was going to happen whether or not I added Flexbox here. I made a demo to show you how this improved wrapping behavior can come in handy on responsive sites specifically. This article header uses Flexbox as an enhancement on top of display table cell to lay out and align its chunks of text at all viewport sizes. And it switches the layout automatically without a media query. The header is basically a media block UI pattern that you see everywhere with an image plus a block of text beside of it. Except here, the text portion stretches to fill the whole width and the whole height available, thanks to Flex on the category, the green block, and align content on the multiple rows. Using Flex to push the date to the opposite side is a great enhancement for what happens when there's not enough room to fit both the category and the date on the same line, such as when the viewport is very narrow or the category is very long, or both. We, of course, have lots of different ways to align content on opposite sides of a line with old CSS, but if I used floating or text align to push the date to the right side, when the date needed to wrap, it would wrap down to the right edge, just like in the non-Flexbox version of the map mini info window, which again looks awkward. Using Flex instead, it wraps to the left side, which looks a lot more natural. This is not the only alignment enhancement that Flexbox can accomplish that no other CSS can produce. I briefly showed you the align content property, but there are two other Flexbox alignment properties that allow you to align content in new ways really simply, which is invaluable in responsive sites where the content wraps differently at different viewport sizes. For instance, Flexbox can equally distribute an unknown number of items across an area of unknown width or height, such as making a nav bar full width with equal spaces in between the links. If you wanted to make a nav bar like this, you'd probably first turn to display table cell, and you would be able to make the nav full width with the first item all the way to the left, the last item all the way to the right. And if you use table layout fixed, you could even make each link box equal width. But you discover that you could not get equal spacing between the text block of each link. So see, if I do display table and table layout fixed on the UL, it makes each LI the same width, so they look equally spaced if they have backgrounds or borders. But remove the backgrounds and borders, and you will see that the gaps between the actual link's text is not equal. Longer links have smaller spaces around them, shorter links have bigger spaces. But Flexbox can fix these unequal gaps really simply. So here's a simple nav bar from my Flexbox demo site, s'moresday.us. For the starter layout, I used inline-block to just center the links in a row under the logo. So they don't stretch full width, but there's nothing broken or wrong looking. It works in a responsive page. But there's no reason why I can't add a few lines of Flexbox on top of this CSS to enhance the responsiveness of the nav further. The links can be flex items and inline-block at the same time. So to make the links flex items, I set display flex on list nav, which is the parent UL. And setting display to flex automatically sets the flex direction to its default value of row, which controls the flow direction of the flex items within the container. So even if I left off the second line, the children LI would become flex items laid out on a single horizontal line. So far, nothing has changed in appearance by adding Flexbox. I still just have a centered horizontal nav. But now that the LI are flex items, I can take advantage of Flexbox's advanced alignment properties, such as justify content. Setting it to space between moves the first and last LI flex items to the edges and then equally distributes the space in between the links. Justify content is a property set on the Flex container, which aligns the child Flex items along the main axis, which again is set by the Flex direction property. So in this case, the main axis is horizontal because my Flex items are laid out in a row. So justify content affects their horizontal alignment. I can use both inline-block and Flexbox together on the nav so that the items will still be centered in non-Flexbox browsers and be full width in Flexbox browsers. And again, I don't need to hide anything. I just add these two lines in pink. That's all the Flexbox I need. And here's how the nav then looks on medium width screens. So the links stretch out in the Flexbox version. Now having the nav filling the full width looks great on medium width screens like this. But on really wide screens, it starts looking too stretched out. I wanted to make it more responsive to this extra space, so I decided to use Flexbox to pin the first two links to the left of the logo and the last two links to the right of the logo. To do this, I first added a media query for wide screens, and I also need to add a link to the Modernizr script, because I need to feed some styles to only Flexbox browsers in this case, as you'll see in just a moment. Now, much of the time, as I've said, Flexbox and Fallback styles can coexist, as they did with the medium width version of the nav that I just showed you, which used inline-block and Flexbox together. But occasionally they will conflict, and you'll only want to apply a certain property if Flexbox is in effect, or vice versa. So the Modernizr script is perfect for this. It can detect whether the browser does or doesn't support Flexbox and which version it supports, and then it adds the appropriate classes to the HTML tag, which you can use to scope your rules in your CSS. So here I used Modernizr's Flexbox class to scope this new rule to only Flexbox browsers, where I want the nav to move up on the same line as the logo. Non-supporting browsers will not use this rule, so they'll still get the inline-block centered nav beneath the logo. Only the Flexbox version of the nav will move up. Now, to move the last two links to the right side, I simply set margin left auto on the third link, the throw a party link, again scoped to only Flexbox browsers. And the reason that this works is that in Flexbox, if you set a margin in the main axis to auto, that margin will take up all of the free space left. So with margin left auto on the throw a party link, the browser places all the extra space in the line to its left, effectively pushing it and everything after it to the right edge. So this pink box is the entire margin on the throw a party link. So I get the appearance of a split list without having to cheat and break this into two lists, which is less accessible and robust and also doesn't really work so well in responsive web design where I need to have the same HTML at all viewport widths. This is a simple navbar, but thanks to a bit of Flexbox, it can make full use of the changing width. Flexbox increases its responsiveness as an enhancement where available. Flexbox is not only a great way to make better use of the changing widths in a responsive layout, but also to make better use of the changing height. So as your viewport changes width, the content wraps differently, so the amount of height that items take up also changes. And Flexbox can enhance the appearance of this variable height because it works in any direction. So let's say that I want to show some social media icons down the side of each article or media object, and each will have a wrapper class and then two blocks inside, icons to hold the images, content to hold the text. This media object content varies, as does the viewport width, which controls the wrapping, so the height of each varies. And if I want to equally space the icons to take up this full height, I cannot set them to height 33% because their parent has no explicitly set height to base these percentages off of. So a percentage height value here does nothing, unfortunately. But I don't need the height property with Flexbox. First, I make the icon section and the content section flex items with default horizontal row alignment. And I do this because I need them to be equal height. And as I've said before, sibling flex items are equal height by default, thanks to the align items property set to stretch by default. And you can't see it here because the icons are still top aligned within their block, but if the two blocks had background colors, you would see that the icons section stretches to match the height of the content section. It doesn't just stop when its images end. So they're equal height now. The align items property, again, is what is responsible for this, and it's set on the flex container to align the flex items in the cross axis. So this media object uses the default flex direction of row. So the main axis is horizontal, so the cross axis is vertical. So align items affects the item's vertical alignment in this case. So remember, justified content controls alignment in the main axis, and align items controls it in the cross. So finally, we can do equal height columns. We can do vertical centering with a single property. Yay! So now the icons and the content sections are equal height flex items, but I haven't done anything to the individual icon images. They are not flex items because only children of a flex container become flex items, not all descendants. But something can be both a flex item and a flex container. So I turn the icon section into a flex container, which makes its 3 children icon images flex items. But this time, I set flex direction to column to stack them vertically. So the default value of row places them side by side, but column value lays them out vertically from top to bottom. This doesn't change anything visually yet. They already were stacked vertically. But remember that flex direction also controls the main axis. With flex direction column, the icon's main axis is now vertical. So I can use justify content space between to equally space them over the main axis, the height, no matter how tall it is. And here's the result. Each media object has a different height, but the icons always span the full height with equal spaces in between. To make this work with non-Flexbox browsers, you can use whatever technique you normally would to get the icon block to sit next to the content block, such as display table cell or floating. Both of those can exist with Flexbox. I'm not going to walk through this code, but the point is just for you to see that Flexbox and table display can be used on the same elements, and Flexbox will just override the table properties. If you choose to float, be aware that if you are also feeding old WebKit, the old 2009 syntax, it has a bug where flex items that are also floated will disappear. But all you have to do is add position relative to bring them back. But again, this is just a bug that only applies to old browsers with the old syntax. Now, in the case of the floated icons, the only tiny piece that I needed to hide from Flexbox supporting browsers was the left margin on the content block. That should only apply if the icon block is floated to keep the content from wrapping underneath it. I do not want it on if Flexbox is active, because that would add a huge gap between the two flex item blocks. So I used Modernizr's no Flexbox class to apply that left margin only in non-supporting browsers that will be using floats. Other than that, there's no other styles in this example that conflict and need to be isolated from each other. So with the fallback CSS in place in non-supporting browsers, the icons will simply be top-aligned with the text if I used floating, or if I used display table cell or inline-block as my fallback. I can use vertical align middle to vertically center them as a block with the block of text. And again, there's nothing wrong with either of these alignments. They're just a bit different than the full-height Flexbox version. The browsers that don't support Flexbox have about 5% global market share. So a few users will see the non-Flexbox versions that I have shown you in these examples. But none of those versions look wrong or broken, just a little different, which is already happening all the time anyway. Flexbox is simply an enhancement to make better use of the space, especially between your breakpoints. It's not a true grid system and was not meant to be, so it's not the best choice for overall page layout, but it is a great choice for intelligently sizing and aligning components and smaller chunks of content within the major page sections. Flexbox also lets you visually rearrange content, which comes in handy on responsive sites where you're stuck with the same HTML order at all sizes, but you want to shuffle content around on different views. It sometimes is hard to make a block go where you want it to when you're tied to a certain source order, but Flexbox makes this easier too. So remember the split navbar? I used relative positioning and a negative top value to move the navbar up, overlapping the same line as the logo. That's fine, but since the logo is not actually in the middle of the list, the links on either side can overlap it if the browser window gets too small. I avoid this with a media query, but if the logo was actually moved in the flow to the middle of the list, I wouldn't have to do this. But I don't want to move the logo in the middle of the list in the HTML, because on narrow screens, I still want it to come before the list, to be stacked on top of the narrow version. But with Flexbox, I can keep the logo before the links in the HTML, but move it visually and in the flow to the middle using the order property. You set the order property on flex items to specify which order you want the browser to lay them out in their container, regardless of the HTML order. And the browser just runs from the lowest numbers, including negative, to the highest. You can think of it like assigning the items a position number in a line. By default, all the flex items are in position 0. And since they're in the same position, they simply follow the source order. But if sibling flex items have different order values from each other, because you give them those different order values, the browser will lay them out in ascending order of those values. Here, I want the first two links to stay first, so they need the lowest order value. I'll just keep them with the default of 0. The logo comes next, so it gets the next highest order value of 1. And the last two links need to come after the logo, so they get the next highest order value of 2. Now that the logo is part of the line, not separate from it, it won't work to just have margin left auto on the throw a party link as before, because with every last bit of space on the line to its left, the logo will be stuck with the first two links on the left side, rather than in the middle, as you can see it's stuck here. To fix this, I can use 2 auto margins, and the browser will simply divide the extra space on the line evenly between the 2 items with those margins. So the throw party link already had margin left auto on it from before, but I'll add the same to logo. Then half the extra space goes on the left side of the logo, half the extra space on the left side of throw party, and thus logo is moved to the center. In order to make this work, I did have to move the logo from outside the UL to inside of it at the same level as other links. That's because order only works on siblings within the same Flex container. You can't move elements outside their Flex container to before or after stuff that's outside the container. This does make it limiting. You have more source order independence than with current layout methods, but you still don't have complete freedom to move anything anywhere. This is perhaps a good thing, because you don't want to go crazy moving everything around with the order property. When you reorder content using Flexbox, you're only reordering it visually. It does not change the screen reading order or the tab order. If the content you're reordering contains text or tabbable content, or both, you need to make sure that the HTML order is logical first, and that the visual reordering that you're doing is just decorative and doesn't change the meaning of the content. Let me give you a simple example of accessible reordering with Flexbox. On this recipe, the photo comes before the ingredients list in the HTML, so that on the wider view it can be floated beside the ingredients, and the narrow mobile view just stacks everything in its default HTML order. But I could use the Flexbox order property to move the photo from its HTML position before the ingredients to above the recipe title on mobile only. Moving the recipe photo would not cause accessibility problems because it doesn't contain any links to be tabbed to, nor does it contain any text to be read by screen readers, because I would give it null alt text, since the recipe text itself provides alternative text for this image. To move the photo, in the styles outside any media queries, I set flex direction to column to stack everything in a single column, and I set the order value of the image to -1. All the other Flex items inside the recipe container have the default order value of 0. -1 is smaller, so the image will come first. It will move up to the top of the stack. On the desktop view, I just turn off Flexbox by setting the recipe's display back to block. That puts the image back in the normal flow, where I can then float it to the right beside the ingredients list. So there's no concern about Flexbox support on desktop, since I'm not using it there, and any mobile browsers that don't support it will simply see the image before the ingredients. You could use this same trick on any sort of media block object with a photo and a chunk of associated text. You can order them logically in the HTML, and then use Flexbox to move the photo around at different viewport sizes. I already showed you the Guardian's job search form, which doesn't use Flexbox, but their main site now does. And they use Flexbox to shuffle stories around when you get to the wide view. The mobile view shows the unchanged HTML order with just normal block stacking. When it's wide, you can see that they have reordered things a bit. So what was the highest content is not now the furthest left content, as you might expect. But they don't use the order property to do this. Flexbox lets you run content not just top to bottom and left to right, but bottom to top and right to left. I think this use of reordering is accessible because these stories can be read in any order and still make sense. The newspaper would like to present them in a certain visual order to emphasize certain ones, which is where Flexbox helps. But their visual order is not really tied to their meaning in this case. The tab order here could potentially be confusing, however, so if you do use Flexbox reordering extensively, like the Guardian has done, please test it with real users if at all possible. I have shown you code for most of these examples, but I do not think that code is the most important part of learning Flexbox. I think the biggest obstacle to getting started with it is not being able to picture how to use it, because you're stuck thinking in terms of the old layout methods and their limitations. It was the same when we made the switch from tables to CSS layout, or from fixed to fluid layout. You were kind of stuck. You had to make a mental shift to start thinking in terms of the new possibilities. Flexbox lets you do a lot of things that you haven't been able to do before, and a lot of things that you could do before, but now in a lot simpler way. Once you see what Flexbox can do in the real world, you can start picturing how to use it in your own work to solve real responsive web design problems today. Flexbox can be tricky to wrap your head around at first, but once you've learned it, it's an incredibly quick, cheap way for you to add more responsiveness to your components. Now, it may sound weird to talk about enhancing responsiveness, but I do not think that responsive design is either on or off. Either your site is responsive or it's not. If your site includes a fluid layout, fluid content, and some media queries, your site includes responsiveness. But there is always more that you could do to enhance that responsiveness further, to make better use of the space available and the properties of the individual pieces of content within your site. Flexbox is one of those things that you can do, as I hope you have seen with these examples. So don't be afraid to add Flexbox to your work, because Flexbox is not all or nothing. You don't need to use every part of it to control every bit of layout across your site. You can keep using floats or table display or whatever else you use to create responsive layouts. Just add Flexbox in one spot to add one little enhancement and see how you can use it to improve responsiveness. Thanks very much.